All right, let's start with section 3. Here's that focus question. By 1774, British actions had eroded the imperial government's legitimacy among many colonists, and opposition to the Intolerable Act spread to small towns and rural areas that had not yet participated in the resistance. While colonists, particularly in New England, intimidated, harassed, and sometimes assaulted British officials and colonists who supported British policies, in September, a convention of delegates from towns across Massachusetts issued the Suffolk Resolves, urging Americans to refuse to obey the new laws, withhold taxes, and prepare for war. To coordinate resistance to the acts, that month the Continental Congress also met in Philadelphia. Composed of political leaders from all the colonies except Georgia, it included such men as John Adams and his more radical cousin Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, and from Virginia, George Washington and Patrick Henry, the latter famously declaring to his fellow Virginians, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Congress adjourned in October 1774 after it agreed to meet the following May if its demands were not met. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolves and formed the Continental Association to halt virtually all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies. The Congress, through the association, authorized local committees of safety to enforce its policies and act against enemies of liberty who violated the boycott or used it as an opportunity to raise prices. This was the beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments, whose authority derived from Great Britain, to extra-legal bodies reflecting the popular will. By early 1775, thousands of men, many of whom were without property and who had never before been part of the political nation, were serving on these committees, which became laboratories for self-government and soon revolution. By 1775, the notions of British liberty that had infused British American political culture were being invoked against Britain itself by indignant colonists of all backgrounds. As the crisis intensified, more and more Americans based their claims for liberty not just on the historical rights of Englishmen, but on more abstract language of natural rights and universal freedom. This language included John Locke's idea that natural rights had existed before the establishment of government, which provided a powerful justification for resistance to imperial British rule. Jefferson insisted that Americans still revered the king, but demanded that empire henceforth be seen as a collection of equal parts, loyal to a constitutional monarch, rather than a system in which one part ruled over the others. When the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, war had already begun between British soldiers and armed Massachusetts citizens. The previous month, British forces marching to Concord to seize arms in that town were met in Lexington by militiamen who tried to resist their advance. In Concord, the British were routed, and after retreating to Boston, scores of militiamen and British troops were killed or wounded. These skirmishes initiated the American War of Independence and inspired colonists in New England and elsewhere to take up arms. New England militias laid siege to Boston, and after failed British attempts to break the siege and the arrival of cannon seized from the British by American militias at Fort Ticonderoga, the British abandoned the city. The Second Continental Congress soon authorized the raising of an army and the printing of money to pay for it, and appointed George Washington its commander. Britain responded by declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and it closed all colonial ports and dispatched thousands of troops. Despite the war's outbreak, many colonists were reluctant to embrace independence from Great Britain. Many were still proud of British political institutions and culture and the power and glory of the British Empire, and more than a few political leaders worried that the rebellion might cause internal social conflict, particularly between elites and the disenfranchised and less wealthy Americans. Leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia, incensed by the Intolerable Acts and confident of their ability to retain authority in those colonies, supported independence, as did many Southern leaders who guarded their political liberties and were enraged by a British proclamation in Virginia in late 1775, offering freedom to escaped slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army. In New York and Pennsylvania, consensus was more difficult to establish. Opposition to British policies had animated small farmers and urban artisans whose calls for a greater voice in political life prompted many leaders to hesitate to call for independence. Some people living in these colonies urged for compromise and predicted that the war would unleash fighting among the colonies. In the beginning of 1776, colonists were strangely both engaged in a war against the British Empire and calling for rights within it. In July 1775, even as Congress organized a continental military, they sent the Olive Branch Petition to George III, reaffirming their loyalty to the crown and hoping for a permanent reconciliation. Ironically, not a colonist, but a recent emigrant to Philadelphia from England, Thomas Paine, offered the arguments that catalyzed the final move toward independence. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, caustically criticized the British Constitution for its principles of hereditary rule and monarchical government, and argued that the residue of tyranny survived in the form of the monarchy and the aristocratic House of Lords. Paine argued that only a democratic system based on frequent elections with a single written constitution could ensure liberty. Most important, Paine argued that America's future prospects within the British Empire were limited. Once America was free of the Navigation Acts and trading freely with the world, its prosperity would be assured. Free from Great Britain, the colonies would also not be entangled in its wars with other European powers, against which the colonists had never had grievances. Paine argued that the colonies' membership in the British Empire was more burdensome than beneficial. He ended the pamphlet by assuring his readers that American independence was linked with the freedom of people everywhere, and argued that the new nation would become a haven for freedom and an asylum for mankind. Although most of Paine's ideas were not original, he addressed them to all Americans rather than just the educated political elite, and made them accessible by expressing them in a clear, direct, and plain language unusual in most political writing at the time. Common Sense quickly became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. The intensification of the war, combined with Paine's stirring appeal for independence, sparked more calls for independence in many American communities. Only 6 months elapsed between the publication of Common Sense and the decision of the Second Continental Congress to declare independence. On July 2, 1776, Congress formally declared the United States an independent nation, and 2 days later it adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson and revised by the Congress before its approval. Most of the Declaration was a long list of grievances directed against King George III, protesting recent policies that threatened to impose on the colonists absolute tyranny. Although a clause condemning the slave trade and criticizing the king for overturning laws limiting slave importation was eliminated after protests by delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. The impact and legacy of the Declaration were contained in its preamble, which was written by Jefferson and stated that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson justified independence by arguing that government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, and that when it threatens its subjects' natural rights, the people have the authority to alter or abolish it. The Declaration ultimately asserts the right of revolution. The Declaration of Independence forever altered the meaning of American freedom. It completed the transformation of the object of American independence from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind. Jefferson argued that natural laws, not the British Constitution or the rights of the freeborn Englishman, justified America's separation from Britain, and the Declaration made freedom a universal entitlement for all people, not a privilege to be enjoyed by a corporate body or people of a certain social class. Jefferson drew upon the theories of John Locke, but by substituting the pursuit of happiness for property in the Lockean triad that opens the Declaration, Jefferson established in America's political culture an open-ended democratic process in which individuals developed their own potential and sought to realize their own life goals. He made individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by government, a central element of American freedom, removing tradition as an obstacle to Americans' desire to shape society as they saw fit. The American Revolution created a distinctive definition of national identity resting on freedom. From its beginning, the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, has been central to American nationality and nationalism. Paine and others believe that the American Revolution was an event of global historical importance with the power to reshape the world. Without the burden of monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privilege of the old world of Europe, America would be a new nation governed by principles of universal freedom. Apart from the Declaration of Independence, 1776 was a momentous year in North America. Spain established Mission Dolores, the first European settlement in San Francisco, to block Russian settlement of the Pacific coast. Indians in San Diego rebelled unsuccessfully against the Spanish, and the Lakota Sioux settled in the Black Hills of North Dakota. Though American colonists were less concerned with securing universal human rights for all mankind than they were with securing international recognition of the independence, Jefferson hoped the rebellion would signal self-government elsewhere. For over 2 centuries, the Declaration has inspired generations of Americans denied the enjoyment of their natural rights and colonial people all over the world seeking independence. It quickly appeared in French and German, and it was considered so dangerous by the Spanish imperial government that it tried to prevent its translation into Spanish. Numerous anti-colonial movements, the first of which occurred in Flanders, where a break with the Austrian Empire brewed, had modeled their efforts on the Declaration of Independence. More than half of today's independent countries have similar declarations. In a global context, the Declaration has become an assertion of the right to form independent states rather than listing a citizen's rights not to be governed governmentally abridged. Furthermore, the notion of the will of the people has been adopted all over the world. Even before the end of the Revolution, European colonists and other empires demanded increased local autonomy, often based on American arguments. To the dismay of those who ruled over them, groups all over the world could speak the language of the rights for the people. So that's the end of section 3.